This is episode 62 of That Shakespeare Life.
Hi, I'm Malcolm Hebron, head of drama at Winchester College and author of Prospero, a Renaissance Magus for the British Library. Another great method for studying the life of William Shakespeare includes listening to this. It's That Shakespeare Life with my friend Cassidy Cash.
It certainly had a very different atmosphere to what we might associate today with places of worship, but it was also a social gathering place. It was a hub for gossip, for trade, for showing off the latest fashions, for meeting people, and I think quite crucially for being seen. And this wasn't just in the churchyard, this was also inside the cathedral.
Welcome to That Shakespeare Life with Cassidy Cash. Cassidy believes that if you desire to successfully learn or perform Shakespeare's plays, then understanding the real life and history of William Shakespeare himself is a must. That Shakespeare Life is the podcast that helps you go beyond the curtain of some of Shakespeare's most iconic works and explore the world of early modern England as Shakespeare would have lived it, learning from the writers, historians, and performers who know it best. And now, here's Cassidy.
During William Shakespeare's lifetime, the central spot for gathering news of the day, purchasing the latest books, or catching up on what's new from your favorite author, poet, or playwright was to be found in the churchyard outside St. Paul's Cathedral in London. Frequenters to this spot were known as Paul's Walkers, and it was a huge number of people indeed that crossed the yard to search the various stalls for literature. There are at least 8 references to St. Paul's Cathedral, and its reputation for promoting the works of authors like William Shakespeare were found inside the plays of the Bard. And today we have our special guest, Amy Lidster, a research fellow at King's College London, here with us to share some of what she's discovered during her research into the Shakespearean history of St. Paul's Cathedral and to walk us through how Shakespeare would have been impacted by this remarkable place. Hello, Amy. Welcome to the show.
Hello. Thank you for having me.
Why is the St. Paul's Cathedral from Shakespeare's life called Old St. Paul's Cathedral? Does that mean the one in London today is a new one?
Yes, that's exactly what it means. So the St. Paul's that you see in London today, with its famous dome, central dome, was designed by Christopher Wren and was built after the Great Fire of London in 1666. And that fire had destroyed the previous structure, which we refer to now as Old St. Paul's. And that would have been the cathedral that Shakespeare would have known. And this was a medieval cathedral. It started to be built in the 11th century and was finally consecrated in the 13th century. And it had a central spire. And 3 years before Shakespeare was born, lightning struck that central spire and it caused a fire and it collapsed. So throughout Shakespeare's life, he sort of knew this medieval cathedral that had a sort of an abrupt stop. And there were lots of stories that were kind of circulated at the time that this was a sign of London's sinfulness, that this central spire had fallen.
Oh, wow. So he would have known about this sort of mark on it. Was it just left there burnt or did they repair it somehow?
They didn't make an effort to repair it. They repaired the structure somewhat, but they never replaced the actual spire itself. So that it was left. There are images that were of St. Paul's that were created during Shakespeare's lifetime that it just shows the cathedral coming to an abrupt stop.
Well, Thomas Dekker writes about the atmosphere of the grounds there at Old St. Paul's inside what's called the dead term from 1608. And Amy quotes Dekker in her article as saying, quote, "What swearing is there? Yea, what swaggering, what facing and outfacing, what shuffling, what shouldering, what jostling, what jeering, what biting of thumbs to beget quarrels, what holding up of fingers to remember drunken meetings, and what braving with feathers, what bearding with mustachios, what casting open of cloaks to publish new clothes." And Amy, when I read this is not at all the reverent sort of environment you think of for a cathedral. So was this environment here among what you call Paul's Walkers really closer to what we think of as like a back alley bar than a churchyard?
Possibly at times. Yeah, it certainly had a very different atmosphere to what we might associate today with places of worship. St. Paul's obviously was still a place to hear sermons, both inside the cathedral and outside in an area called Paul's Cross, where there was an outdoor covered pulpit. But it was also a social gathering place. It was a hub for gossip, for trade, for showing off the latest fashions, for meeting people, and I think quite crucially for being seen. And this wasn't just in the churchyard. This was also inside the cathedral. Between the north and south transept of the cathedral was basically a public thoroughfare. So people would walk through the cathedral on their way to another part of London, for example. And in the nave of the cathedral, this was known as Paul's Walk. And the people who used to congregate there were, as you mentioned, called Paul's Walkers. And they were known for sort of strutting around there, gossiping, talking about politics, fashion, and trading. And one of the things that St. Paul's became really known for was the book trade. And in the churchyard itself, that was the centre, during Shakespeare's lifetime, that was the centre of the London book trade. And there's a wonderful quotation that kind of captures the sense of this environment in a text called "A Scourge for Paper Persecutors." So this is an attack basically on the environment of St. Paul's and the way and the books that are sold there. And it's sort of what I mentioned earlier about the St. Paul's being struck by lightning connects that to the book trade in this extract. And it just says, "It is no wonder that Paul's so often hath been struck with thunder. 'Twas aimed at these shops, in which there lie such a confused world of trumpery, whose titles each term on the posts are reared in such abundance." It's a great quotation that kind of captures this sort of visual busyness that the churchyard in St. Paul's had. And when it references the titles on posts, these are title pages of text that were kind of pasted around the churchyard, and they really advertised everything that was for sale.
And we should mention that this time period is before roads were invented. Like, there were traveling paths, but for a large portion of the populace, when you wanted to get from one place to another, you walked there because things like horses and carriages were not available to just everyone. And certainly this was before cars. So when we think about what paths people would take to get somewhere, and Amy's describing this as a thoroughfare, that means that people were walking from place to place. And that's why it makes sense. This would be like a major highway today. This was where a lot of people were going through here. And you mentioned that it was a place for people to be seen. Do you think for someone like Shakespeare, who had such a focus on making sure he was known, that he would have come here? Would he have visited there himself?
Well, I think undoubtedly he would have. I mean, ultimately, there's no surviving evidence to prove that he went to St. Paul's and, say, bought books. But I think that it would almost have been impossible for him not to have shopped there and wandered around the area. He lived in London for all of his professional life, and we know that he lived nearby in Silver Street for a time. Towards the end of his life, he bought property in the Blackfriars area. So this whole area around St. Paul's and the City of London was his neighbourhood. So he definitely must have been one of the browsers of these bookstores and in amongst this atmosphere.
I'd like to ask you to explain what the word stall means. I think for me, and when I think of this, I think of something more temporary, like here in the US, and I'm sure you have this there in England because I've seen kind of street markets there in England. But I think of it as like a weekend place where, somebody's going to come temporarily and sell their wares at scheduled times or something like that. But I think for St. Paul's, we need to make a distinction about what it means to have bookstalls there, because you said there were church services going on, but at the same time, in literally the same place, there's all this selling, negotiating, and bartering going on outside. So explain for us how all of that goes together. And if we were to walk up there with Shakespeare in the 17th century, what are we going to see?
Well, okay, so firstly, yes, so stall sounds something like a temporary structure, but during Shakespeare's time, these bookstores or bookshops were actually quite substantial structures. They're quite similar to what we think of as bookshops today, really. So in St. Paul's churchyard itself, there were dozens of bookshops, and they would line the inner wall of the cathedral and also the outer walls of the cathedral and the inner walls of the churchyard wall. And most of these structures were at least 2 stories tall. Some of them in Paul's churchyard were about 4 stories. They were inner areas where shoppers could come in and browse books inside. Some of them were also dwellings, so you'd have various people living in these buildings as well. And all of these bookshops would have a sign, a pictorial sign that would identify which shop it was. So you have, say, the sign of the parrot, the sign of the angel, sign of the white greyhound, sign of the Bible. So very similar to English pub signs today. And that would be the way of identifying all of these dozens of bookshops. There might have been some traders also that just transported their wares on a cart and were moved around. But when we're talking mostly about all the bookshops in London and the publishers and their various locations, we're definitely referring to fixed, permanent, quite substantial locations.
And this wasn't seen as disrespectful to the churchyard at all. I mean, this all seems very normal, and it's quite foreign concept to me that would be okay, that the church didn't mind.
Well, the church, they did mind. There were certain people there were efforts to get rid of the bookshops at certain points. There were people would write pamphlets about, the things like the bookshop, say the scourge for paper persecutors is attacking this kind of atmosphere, the trading, the socializing, the gossiping. It was a subject for attack, but it was also something that did go on a regular basis. So you would have the central churchyard near St. Paul's, called Paul's Cross Churchyard, where most of the bookshops were collected, had the outdoor pulpit in the centre, Paul's Cross, and sermons would be delivered there at the same time as you have all of these booksellers engaging in trade. You could listen to John Donne deliver a sermon outside at Paul's Cross while you browse the bookstores and pick up Shakespeare's Venus and Adonis, for example.
That's fascinating. Now, was St. Paul's the only church doing this kind of thing, or was it normal for all churches to have these kind of bookstalls?
Well, the books trade was scattered throughout London. And there were other places of worship. So nearby in those vicinities, there could be a similar overlap between the place of worship and trading in books and other wares. But St. Paul's was the centre of the book trade. So here in London, it would have been most pronounced in this location.
Now, we mentioned the difference between modern culture and Shakespeare's life in terms of roads, but we've also talked about how St. Paul's and this bookstall atmosphere happening here was a place for getting news. So Amy, explain for us, were there newspapers in the 16th century, or was information spread strictly through gossip?
There weren't newspapers in the way that we think of them today, but they did have news publications. And in fact, not long after Shakespeare's death, so when Shakespeare died in 1616, in the early 1620s, the very first serial news publications started to be published in England. And these were published by a syndicate of stationers, who the most public figure of which was Nathaniel Butter, who was based in Paul's Churchyard. And these individuals published what they called weekly news, or sometimes they titled it a continuation of our weekly news. They weren't always quite that regular. And these pamphlets mostly commented on foreign conflicts. So in particular, the 30 Years' War, which had started in 1618. But during Shakespeare's lifetime, these serial publications didn't exist. And the kinds of news publications that Shakespeare could have accessed and other readers would have just been short pamphlets that were not published on a regular basis, but that might report on things like battles that have taken place, certain political developments, although caution would have been needed. Sometimes they might have reported on key events like the aftermath of the gunpowder plot, saw quite a lot of publications that reflected on that. There were some kinds of publications that were around, but also St. Paul's was a centre for gossiping and exchanging news outside of the medium of print.
Now, you mentioned the stationers were the ones who got together when it came time to start publishing weekly news, or they decided to do this. It was the stationers who did that. And Amy quotes, I believe it's Ben Jonson, talking about a particular decayed stationer who was at St. Paul's Cathedral under the sign of the Pied Bull, and he calls him a, quote, true Paul's bread. Now, there's so much to unpack about that statement, but Amy, first tell us, what is the role of a stationer? I think one of the main records we have of how we know things about William Shakespeare himself is we look it up and we say, oh, it's recorded in the Stationer's Register that this happened, at this time. Can you draw a distinction for us about being a stationer who runs a bookstall and what it means for Shakespeare's plays to have been recorded in the official Stationer's Register? Are those the same thing?
Okay, so a stationer is an umbrella term that is used to describe all of the individuals that are involved in the book trade. So these are printers, publishers, booksellers, scribes, paper manufacturers, and all of these individuals were part of what's called the Stationers' Company. And the Stationers' Company received a royal charter in 1557, and what the Stationers' Company did was oversee all of the working practices of its stationers, and it worked to protect their interests and their rights. And one of the things that they protected was the stationers' rights to publish specific texts. And one of the ways in which the rights to publish specific texts could be protected was by a stationer entering a title for a fee in what we call the Stationer's Register. So it's essentially the Stationer's Register are the records of the company. And this was something that would protect something that's akin to copyright today. So yes, we definitely see Shakespeare's plays and poems cropping up in the Stationer's Register. The first entry is for Venus and Adonis in 1593. I think the first play is Titus Andronicus in 1594. And Shakespeare's name first makes its appearance in 1600 for a joint entry for the second part of Henry IV and Much Ado About Nothing. And I think this is an indication that by this point, Shakespeare's name was acquiring quite a sort of cultural capital in a way that it was important to include his name as part of an entry. And I think that's another important point, is that it wasn't the authors that were doing the entering, it was the stationers that were entering these texts in the register. And it was stationers who controlled copyright and the right to publish text. So authors didn't have that control in the way that they do today. And that's one of the things that makes it hard for us to just figure out how involved Shakespeare was in the publication of his own texts. How was he involved in the process? Did he object to it? Because the trade favoured stationers, it makes it much harder to figure out Shakespeare's role, because he himself is so silent when it comes to his feelings towards publication.
Amy's article suggests that by 1600, William Shakespeare was, quote, the most published professional dramatist, with many of his works being distributed here at St. Paul's Cathedral. Now, you've already said that we can't be sure exactly what Shakespeare's role was in getting these available that way, but I want to know, was Shakespeare famous because his plays were published here, or was he published that prolifically there as an example of his fame? Which way did that go?
That's really interesting, and it's a difficult question. So I would say that the plays and the poems of Shakespeare were published in St. Paul's in the 1590s, and the fact that that happened in such considerable numbers really helped to establish his reputation as a published writer. So he's not just as a dramatist for the stage. And the texts of his that were published, there were the long poems, Venus and Adonis, The Rape of Lucrece, and a collection of poems, most of which are now not recognized as being Shakespeare's, called The Passionate Pilgrim. And these are all published at the sign of the White Greyhound. And the plays that were published were Richard II, Richard III, the two parts of Henry IV, and Much Ado About Nothing. And they were all published at the sign of the Angel. And all of these texts were attributed to Shakespeare. And that's quite exceptional at this period. For the poems, it's less exceptional. It was more Shakespeare's name is attached to the dedications in Venus and Adonis and The Rape of Lucrece. And that was fairly common practice. But for the plays, this is really unusual. Most plays were issued anonymously. Shakespeare's previous plays that had appeared in print, Titus Andronicus and the second and third parts of Henry VI, although they were not given those names, those are the folio names, they appeared anonymously. So these were the very first plays to have his name right smack in the middle of the title page. And I think that's really important. It helped to establish Shakespeare's reputation. Now, the question of who decided to advertise Shakespeare's name and why, and whether Shakespeare was involved in the publication of these texts and in the way in which they were marketed, that's another matter, and that's something that's much more difficult to resolve. But I think it's clear that these texts, which became his best-selling editions, they all advertised his name. They were all geographically connected and concentrated in the same part of St. Paul's churchyard. They had lasting consequences for establishing his reputation.
Do we have copies of these books that you said these were best-selling editions for Shakespeare? Do any of these survive today?
Yeah, absolutely. So these are the early single text editions of Shakespeare's plays. So, for example, Richard II, what we call it's a quarto edition, single text playbook. The first edition was published in 1597, and copies do exist in libraries across the world. And then there were multiple editions published within a few years of each other because these editions became so popular. And there are scattered copies in places like the British Library and the Huntington and the Folger, and new copies are being discovered still today. You can actually go and pick up, call out from the British Library and other repositories these very first early editions.
Which, of course, now I'm going to have to go and do. That's fascinating. Now, you published in your article on Medium about a presentation you did on St. Paul's, and Amy describes in this presentation a significant detail on where King Lear was first published. Amy, why did the location of King Lear's first publication catch your attention?
Well, in general, I think we often overlook the importance of publishing locations when talking about early modern drama. So I think looking at where plays first appeared and were published gives us a really good sense about how the publisher might have read that text. Why does this text survive? Does this text give us an understanding of the other kinds of publications in the surrounding area? Because often different locations could be associated with different kinds of publications. But for King Lear specifically, I became interested in it because it quite prominently identifies its place of publication on its 1608 title page as being at the sign of the Pied Bull in Paul's churchyard, and it was published by Nathaniel Butter. And I was already interested in Nathaniel Butter at this point because he is one of the first news publishers that I mentioned earlier that started publishing serial news books in the 1620s. And he was the public face, basically, of the enterprise, and he got this reputation for himself for publishing newsworthy texts. He was often criticized for people thought that they were essentially full of lies and not exactly very truthful, and he just had an appetite for acquiring as many topical texts as he could. And it made me wonder what interested Butter in this 1608 edition of King Lear's. This was before he'd got involved in serial news publication, but you can see this interest in topical texts extending back to the very beginning of his career. So that made me wonder why he chose to invest in King Lear.
Now, Amy specifically draws attention to King Lear relating to James I and his plan to unify England and Scotland. Now, Amy, this is likely just a result of this being an area I need to read more on, but this was the first time I had seen someone connect King Lear specifically to King James and his unification of England and Scotland. That's usually reserved for Macbeth, where Shakespeare is concerned. So can you share with us why you think King Lear, and at least this 1608 publication of the play, was designed to emphasize James's project?
Yes, well, I think Shakespeare's play is clearly interested in the pressing Jacobean concerns of that period, and in particular James's Union project. First, just through its subject matter, it dramatizes ancient British history. So King Lear was supposedly a monarch that ruled Britain in the 8th century BC. And this was a kind of history that particularly appealed to James I. And he used that to promote his union project for England and Scotland, and to promote his position as a ruler of a united Britain. Because in these ancient histories, Britain was the name, the collective name that referred to the Isle at that point. So James drew on those as a kind of precedent for reuniting England and Scotland under his rule. These ancient histories could also offer quite a pessimistic view, because they are full of civil war and death, murder, uprisings. So in some ways, James uses them because they provide a model for a united Britain, but also they are a model for division and disintegration, because some of these ancient British kings divided their kingdom, as Lear did, and as the very first ancient British monarch, who is Brute, who was a Trojan, who supposedly came to Britain and founded Britain. He also divided his kingdom, which led to civil war. So when Shakespeare chooses to dramatize this kind of history, it has a clear bearing on James's project. And Shakespeare chooses to open King Lear with a scene between Kent and Gloucester. And the second line of the text references the division of the kingdoms. And I think that would just be immediately flag up for early Jacobean audiences how topical this play is, and how it's engaging with the histories and the legacies that James was so interested in. And when Lear appears on stage for the first time, he brings on a map of Britain, which was a relatively unusual early modern stage prop, and sort of is marking out divisions on that map. So the play itself is definitely attentive to its Jacobean context. But I think with Shakespeare, it's very hard to say that the place has a particular interpretation or supports some kind of reading. I think Shakespeare's plays tend to ask more questions than give answers, and they allow you maybe to say, I will choose to read this play as a unionist text, as an anti-unionist text, as one that isn't actually that interested in bigger political pictures, but maybe King Lear is more about a personal individual tragedy. But Shakespeare's play, I think, leaves that open for you to decide yourself. And I think one of the people that first made that decision was the publisher, Nathaniel Butter. So he published King Lear in 1608. And this was a time that was right at the peak of union debates. And Butter himself sought after lots of topical texts. He published another text by John Davis called Bienvenue, which was supposedly about the meeting of Christian IV of Denmark and James, but it really is ultimately, the subtext is a celebration of James's union project. So you can see that through Butter and through looking at the publisher, we can kind of see what this text might have meant to him and get a sense of what Shakespeare's plays meant to his contemporaries.
So what was Ben Jonson referring to when he called that decaying stationer a true Paul's bread?
Well, yeah, Jonson is being derogatory and satirical here, but I think what he's saying is that Nathaniel Butter he was born and bred in St. Paul's churchyard. His family were stationers as well, and he kind of embodies the churchyard and the churchyard atmosphere. So he is a trader. He is a public face. People know him. He has a reputation. He kind of captures the atmosphere of this bartering, trading, gossiping, politically and religiously invested parts of London. And that is something that we can obviously see, on the title page of King Lear, which I think is something that's often overlooked, that this title page it connects the play to Shakespeare. It very prominently advertises Shakespeare's authorship, but it also really prominently advertises Butter's involvement in this text, and it connects his reputation, and it connects the location of St. Paul's to King Lear.
Well, this is a fascinating topic that we could go very deep in, and I know we would love to learn more. So what are some of your favorite books and resources where we should go if we are now sold on learning more about this topic? Where should we look?
Well, as a really great resource, I would suggest Shakespeare Documented, which is freely available online, and it's a great resource for looking into Shakespeare's life, works, documents connected to him, stationers' register entries. There are very, really good quality images and transcriptions and introductions to these materials. For learning more about Shakespeare and his connection to London and his play's connection to London, I'd recommend a book called Shakespeare in London by Hannah Crawford, Sarah Dustergear and Jennifer Young. And then if you're interested in more about St. Paul's Cathedral and the culture surrounding it, there's a very substantial text called St. Paul's, the Cathedral Church of London, edited by Derek Keane, Arthur Burns and Andrew Saint. And there's also now a forthcoming book on this same subject called Old St. Paul's and Culture, which hopefully will be out next year. And the material that I've written about in the Medium article, for example, will be in there on a chapter. So watch the space for further details about this forthcoming book.
So your chapter will be in that book?
Yes, it will. Yes.
Exciting. Congratulations. We'll definitely watch for that. Now, we ask everyone this next question here at That Shakespeare Life, and that's, what's the one book you would take with you on a deserted island? My friends in England tell me I am supposed to allow you the complete works of Shakespeare and a copy of the Bible. So this choice would be in addition to those.
Gosh, okay. I hope I'm allowed to specify which editions of Shakespeare's works and the Bible that I can take with me. But
oh, absolutely. I think since we've focused on one 1608 publication of King Lear, that would be most appropriate.
Yes. For the other text, well, I'd want something that would last me a long time and that would be useful, I think, on a deserted island. So I think seeing as we've been talking about early modern literature, I'm going to opt for Robert Burton's The Anatomy of Melancholy, which is perhaps an unusual choice, but it's a very first published in 1621, went through several editions and expanded, and it's all about basically human emotion and the subject of melancholy, and it's an encyclopedia kind of, and it's serious, it's thoughtful, it's full of digressions and humor, and it's essentially looking at the various causes of melancholy. And I feel like that's something that I would quite like to sit and think about on my deserted island. It'd probably be quite relevant in that kind of context.
No better time to sit and wax philosophical than when you're on a deserted island.
Exactly.
Absolutely. Well, what's next for you? What are you working on now that you're excited about?
Well, I'm working on a few books at the moment. I'm finishing up, hopefully over the summer, a book about Shakespeare's histories and the histories of history plays of other dramatists, which is going to be, I think, called Unruly Histories. So that should hopefully be done this summer. But the other main project that I'm working on, and the book that I'm starting to write, is one about wartime Shakespeare. And this is part of a larger project at King's College London, where I'm based. And this is looking at how productions of Shakespeare's plays have been used to shape public opinion about specific conflicts, going from the 17th century through to the 21st century. So beginning with the 9 Years' War and ending with the Iraq War. So that's my current project, and hopefully in a couple of years' time, that book will be finished.
Well, those sound fascinating. Please keep us updated on those, and we'll definitely post about that when they become available so that people can read those. Amy Lidster, thank you so much for being here today and for sharing this history with us. This has been delightful.
It's been a pleasure. Thank you.
Links to the various locations, books, and history material mentioned by Amy inside today's episode are listed for you, along with even more history of Old St. Paul's Cathedral. Find all that and more inside the show notes for today's episode at CassidyCash.com/episode 62. That's CassidyCash.com/EP62. If you want to go beyond the episode and get hands-on with your Shakespeare history, you can now sign up to be an official member of That Shakespeare Life. Members get listed as producers for the show and are able to submit ideas and suggestions for programming. They also get exclusive members-only access to Shakespeare history mini-courses on things like authentic Tudor recipes, Elizabethan card and board games, all of which are mentioned in the Plays of the Bard, along with guides and resources on how to create these activities at home or within your classroom. Find out more and sign up at CassidyCash.com/member. That's CassidyCash.com/member. That's it for this week here at That Shakespeare Life. I'm Cassidy Cash, that Shakespeare girl, and I hope you learned something new about the Bard. I'll see you next week. Bye-bye.
Thank you for listening to That Shakespeare Life. As always, the best conversations happen after the episode over at CassidyCash.com. Become a part of a vibrant Shakespeare conversation by adding your voice over at the website. Until next time, remember, when you want to know William Shakespeare, you have to go behind the curtain and into That Shakespeare Life.